of this election has been very cunningly concealed in the folds of the Union Jack.
David Lloyd George, one of the greatest of the old-style campaigners. Nationwide tonight, we ask whether television has put paid to the age of the orator.
Nearly 5 years after a health scare.
But first, the television election. For the next 3 weeks, you'll hardly be able to turn on your set without a politician leaping out of it. Beginning with the Alliance morning press conference at 8:30 each day, each campaign is crammed full of interviews, photo calls, calf cuddling and baby kissing, all aimed at filling the news and current affairs programmes with the right words and, even more important, the right image. Tonight we look at what effect broadcasting has had on electioneering. 60 years ago, when the performance at the hustings rather than on the small screen was what mattered, Lloyd George showed him
Never effect real disarmament until you renounce war not merely on a scroll of paper, but in the hearts of men.
The issues, of course, often remain the same. Well, Michael Foot's mentor, Aneurin Bevan, was also a politician who belonged to the street corner and the large crowd. Because elections were decided at the hustings, the quality of speaking was crucial. A politician had to be able to inspire passion and move large audiences.
That's why it seems to me that if we are to safeguard employment in Great Britain, we have to be resolute about it and clear about it and say we can only safeguard employment for planning in other parts of the world.
Aneurin Bevan speaking in the early 50s. The first party political broadcasts on television came in the 1951 election, although coverage of the campaign and the counts themselves were still not allowed. Nevertheless, it was becoming clear to politicians that a completely different approach was needed, a conversational manner instead of all that rhetoric and passion. Leslie Mitchell is the interviewer here.
I'm most grateful to Mr. Anthony Eden for inviting me to cross-question him on the present political issues. I would like, too, to feel that I am asking, so far as possible, those questions which you yourselves would like to ask in my place. Well, now, Mr. Eden, with your very considerable experience of foreign affairs, it's quite obvious that I should start by asking you something about the international situation today, or perhaps you would prefer to talk about home. Which shall it be?
Well, you know, during this election, I've found that the voters, while they are preoccupied, naturally enough, with this international situation, and particularly with the Middle East.
No doubt some of today's candidates would relish such an easy ride. Well, by the end of the 50s, politics was getting much fuller and indeed more critical coverage by television. And politicians were realising the power of being able to address voters in their own homes, albeit from a box in the corner. Parties began to choose performers who were most adept at the intimate style necessary.
Good evening. In all the reports in this campaign, we've concentrated on the future and what it can hold for us. But the future belongs, above all, to the young, and they have their own reasons for supporting Labour.
During this election, I've travelled right through the country. Scotland, Yorkshire, Lancashire, the Midlands, East Anglia, and of course London and the Home District, and South Wales. What has struck me throughout is how buoyant everybody is. Everyone feels that Britain is in top form.
And you missed out the whole of the West Country there. There's always the danger of pointing at maps. Bob Carville, this is your 11th election. What do you think? Do you think that the arrival of television and the demands it puts on politicians has quelled the oratorical fire in their bellies?
There's certainly very much less opportunity for the oratorical fire that we've just seen from Lloyd George and Aneurin Bevan. Yes, it took the politicians a long time to recognise that the prime medium for reaching the voter was in fact television. Of course, it took the television authorities a long time to realise that.
And to the election campaign, not, though I hasten to add, a signal to wheel on the politicians. Let me instead wheel on Glyn Worsnip with his view of the first few days of what you might call election fever.
Well, it's hard to believe it was only 9 days ago that Maggie made her surprise announcement. The surprise, of course, was not that there was to be a general election, but that she'd actually taken the advice of her ministers, because she didn't want an election, far from it.
Never has a party been more reluctant to enter a general election.
Absolutely. With only a 15% lead in the opinion polls and Michael Foot as opposition leader, who would be so foolish? But she was ready, if it was in the public interest, unlike some MPs who were in the public house.
And now there's a frantic, devastating rush to clear everything up. I mean, my wife's in New Zealand, where her father's just died. I'm sending messages, come home, for heaven's sake. I haven't got a clean shirt or a clean pair of underpants to fight an election campaign. We've got no agent, we've got no party organisation to speak of. The Labour Party is in chaos as usual.
No underpants, naked into the debating chamber, as an Iron Bevan might have said. And what use is a foot without a sock, as some of Dennis Healy's supporters are still saying. Now, the man on Austin Mitchell's right, the man who went... he could afford to laugh. He's Nicholas Winterton, Tory candidate for Macclesfield. No one could accuse him of chauvinism. He's letting his wife, Anne, also stand as a Tory candidate, but only in the neighbouring constituency of Congleton. That's so she can bring him his clean shirts and underpants when they meet for some boundary changes. As for the SDP Liberal Alliance, Mr. Roy Jenkins appeared not even able to remember what a rosette is. When someone handed him one, he looked as incredulous as if he was being offered Limeswold with his claret. Of course, it might be that he was just confused about what colour it should be. Anyway, this week the campaign began in earnest, as every newsreader has been saying every day since last March. Everyone started having conferences. Everyone, that is, except the Tories, who've wisely elected not to start boring us all until Friday. Sadly, owing to the rules of balance, we have to report what they're saying, even when they've chosen not to say anything. So let's talk about the Tories' very own modern miracle of microtechnology, which has been at work sending out direct mail shots to selected voters, personally signed by the computer, although the signature reads Cecil Parkinson. But then is Cecil Parkinson perhaps himself a computer? Tory headquarters, as befits the party of the family, is keeping mum. Anyway, so skilled is this computer that it sent one of its first mail shots to a Mr. P. Hayne, the Labour candidate for Putney. Still, it's worth trying. He's changed parties before. Why not again? At the First Alliance press conference at 8:30 a.m. on Monday morning, the best thing on the menu was the breakfast which preceded it. £1.50 the continental, £3 the cooked. At the conference itself, there was an interesting reaction from journalists to the most vital part of Mr. Roy Jenkins' speech.
This is a vital subject for the future. In our support for industry, we have made it clear that this would be particularly directed towards science-based high-technology industries. We also think that this is one reason for cooperating on a European scale.
Very rude, I thought, especially as on that first day the Alliance had most thoughtfully provided them with transport to transport them to Transport House for the Labour Party conference at 9 o'clock. And sure enough, yesterday morning, when the journalists rushed outside, there was another coach awaiting. This time, though, they weren't so lucky. It was one of the Alliance's private battle buses, and the driver told them where to get off. Only an intrepid BBC man, Radio 4's John Sargent, was prepared to dig for the facts to the bitter end.
Is this bus going for a trash? To Transport House? You already know, actually. We just say yes or no. If you're not, you're not. I let you know. We don't know where they're going. That'd be pretty true. Oh. They don't know where they're going.
Happily, he made it in time to enjoy to the full what was left of the Labour press conference. Before the first question of that first Labour press conference of this momentous campaign, General Secretary Jim Mortimer made a moving appeal.
You will have gathered what is the main theme of this morning's press conference. May I therefore invite questions, particularly on the main theme. The first question, please.
In the ensuing silence, Mr. Foot generously saluted the great British press, and they eventually responded with that first all-important question.
I would like to ask Mr. Michael Foot, do you still keep the promise that once when you are in power again, you are going to do something to repeal the Nationality Act 1981 as well as to revise the Immigration Act 1971?
Mr. Foot thought very hard before asking what the question was, and discovering that what it was a question for Roy Hattersley, and he wasn't there. Dennis Healy was, though, being very helpful to his rival, that is to say, his fellow Labour leaders. Even when Peter Shaw appeared to have exhausted a subject, Dennis was there to say...
If I could just add one quick comment.
Or, alternatively...
Sorry, Dennis. I just wanted to add to that.
Or sometimes even...
Could I just add to that?
After the press conference, Dennis popped off to Leeds, where so delighted was he at having apparently convinced a voter of how you can be a unilateralist and a multilateralist at one and the same time, that he literally danced for joy. Nice that, wasn't it? Shall we see it again? I suppose you could call it getting in step with your party.
If I could just add one quick comment.
No, Dennis, I'm sure you'll have plenty of opportunities during the campaign. Well, my next diary is on Friday. Meanwhile, if you're a voter, a party worker, a don't know, or just a plain humble candidate and you think you've got a funny story or a friendly bit of gossip that might raise a smile during the election campaign, why not get in touch?
It's cruel stuff. By the way, do let me remind you that next week we begin our on-the-spot interviews with the leaders of the three main parties. That's when you get your chance to put your questions.
Well, it's been a tough week for us serious political journalists, especially since this morning when Mrs. Thatcher at last condescended to speak to the press, and the headmistress slapped some wrists straight away.
You will have to please speak up because we've got such a battery of noise in the front row. Do you think you could hold off while they're asking questions?
Yeah.
Keep it going while we're giving the answers if you wish, but right, thank you.
She was probably in a good mood after early rumours that the meeting had been infiltrated by Arthur Scargill, disguised as a security man, had been Scott. Mrs. Thatcher's theme for today was the economy, so it was as well that an hour earlier Britain's top political and financial journalists had had a fine opportunity at the Alliance press conference to brief themselves thoroughly on the vital statistics which will determine the fate of the body politic. This morning, Mrs. Thatcher was also asked about crime statistics, but not the ones worrying Mr. John Munton, Tory party agent for three candidates around Blackpool. He tells me that all his election plans have been nicked. Photographs, nomination papers, schedules, everything. He was foolish enough to leave them in the Wainwright Conservative Club. Naturally, he's had to complain to the secretary of the club, and since he himself is the secretary, he's even more embarrassed than he might have been. So if you find a black briefcase, initials JM, full of campaign plans, do let me know. I'm sure we all agree it's high time the Blackpool Conservatives knew what they were doing. The friendliest event of the week was yesterday's launch of the Communist Party manifesto. I squeezed myself into their new headquarters, which was crammed with 13 other journalists, to hear General Secretary Gordon McLennan make one of the better jokes so far in the campaign. He said he assumed his one invitation to appear on television at 6 minutes past 6 in the morning on TVAM was a desperate attempt by that company to boost its ratings. Now, I know Mrs. Thatcher has been extolling Victorian values, but I think that the Central Office have gone a little far in running a candidate who lived through the entire Victorian era. He's Mr. Anthony Beaumont Dark, who, according to the West Midlands Area Conservative Guide, was born in October 1832. That was the year of the Whig Reform Bill. And naturally, at the age of 151, Mr. Beaumont Dark's own wig is looking a little in need of reform itself. Mr. Roy Jenkins has also been getting a bit behind the times.
Local income tax is not a practical possibility until the computerization of the inland revenue is complete, which I think is 1887.
No wonder they call him the elder statesman. Now I'm going to introduce you to a young Liberal. Well, a pretty young Liberal. He's one of David Steele's right-hand men, or gaffes, and he told me just how difficult that job can be.
Typically, one would run into a constituency in the bus, for instance, and one would find that the local candidate, instead of organising one meeting, had organised two meetings and said this will only take an extra 5 minutes. Of course, it doesn't take an extra 5 minutes. It's an extra half hour, and we probably leave the candidate in tears with a group of 100 well-wishers on the side of the motorway.
And how does the leader react to that?
Oh, he's sharpened his teeth for that, I think, already.
But rather Andrew than me, because his young leader can get a little mean if crossed, as we discovered this week when he said, through those sharpened teeth,
I think my answer is that we just as well if the young Liberals stayed at home. I think that the day that we have a headline saying young Liberals agree with David Steele, that will be a news story, if I can suggest that to the BBC.
Finally, if you prefer a softer, cuddlier sort of politician, you can always ask Joy Gammon to knit you one. She's got a name for the party leaders, and she says they never answer back, and if they upset you, you can easily take them apart. All we need now is a woolly Liberal. I'll be back next week, and so will Michael, and so will Margaret.
Thank you.
It's quite all right.
And thank you, Glyn. We look...
Diary.
Well, the first really big news of the election so far, of course, came yesterday morning when the Labour Party at last decided who its leader was. Up until then, almost everyone had assumed it was Dennis Healey. And who can blame them? The very day after the election was announced, they'd heard it on the very best authority.
Well, now I'm going to talk to Norman Tebbit and Dennis Healey. Dennis Healey, leader of the Labour Party, first.
And did you notice Mr. Healey didn't even deny it? But it seems that doubts have arisen about Mr. Healey's suitability for this post, ever since he took to going up to female electors and asking questions like...
Now then, gorgeous, how are you?
I'm very well, are you?
Yes, have you got a lovely bunch of coconuts?
Clearly, decisive action was called for, and as Chairman Mortimer told us yesterday, there'd been a dawn meeting of the Commissariat.
The unanimous view of the committee is Michael Foot is the leader of the Labour Party. Michael Foot speaks for the Labour Party, and we are in support of the manifesto policy.
Well, my word, Michael Foot, leader of the Labour Party, and even more bizarre, the Labour Party is campaigning on the Labour Party manifesto. So if Dennis Healey isn't the leader of the Labour Party, who is he? We're hoping to find out later in the programme. But if people aren't sure who Mr. Healey is, there's no doubt about who Mrs. Thatcher is. She's the Queen, to judge from her increasingly imperial use of the Royal One.
You will find that one has said that repeatedly.
What's more, there's evidence that one is adopting the Royal We.
Will you come and meet some of the staff from the docks
Yes,
themselves?
we'd like to.
But if one does become elevated to a higher form of life, who will become one's Prime Minister? Well, my tip is Dennis.
Thank you.
No, not that Dennis, but Dennis Thatcher. And as if in confirmation, after 20 years of silence on politics, Mr. Thatcher gave this week his first in-depth interview on the subject exclusively to this diary.
How are you enjoying the campaign, Mr. Thatcher?
Sorry?
How are you enjoying the campaign so far?
It's all right.
Later, in a shrewd and succinct analysis, he was able to make firm predictions as to the precise result of the election.
We're going to win.
By how much?
Oh, I'm not putting any bets on that. By enough.
And you can't be more precise than that. Of course, the pace of electioneering is already taking its toll, not on the politicians or even on the politicians' husbands, but on those who have to look after them, like one Kentish chief superintendent on whom the strain was clearly too great. May the force be with you. Now, the electors of Chertsey and Walton have been privileged to have top-secret defence plans leaked to them in a letter from Tory candidate Geoffrey Patty. In the last Parliament, he was Minister of State for Defence Procurement, and to reassure voters that our country is in safe hands, he includes a picture showing the weapon he's procured to defend it with. Now, as promised, more about Mr. Healey's latest position, which should reassure politicians of all parties that their message really is getting through.
Who's Dennis Healey?
He's a Prime Minister, isn't he?
Who's David Owen?
He's a Prime Minister as well, isn't he?
Well, they're both Prime Minister.
No, Dennis Healey's the Prime Minister. David Owen, I think, is putting him for Prime Minister, is he?
And what's Margaret Thatcher?
She's a Prime Minister.
Indeed she is. So let's ask her to introduce a summary of the week's major political speeches. Take it away, Margaret.
1, 2, 3.
Rabbit, 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 yep, rabbit, rabbit, yep, rabbit, 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 yep, bunny, 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 jabba, jabba, bunny, jabba,
Do you want me to go on?
No, thanks. That'll be all. I'll be back on Wednesday.
Glyn Worsnip with some personal observations as election day gets nearer.
Election diary.
Well, the biggest scandal of the campaign so far came yesterday evening when the BBC's First Night committed treason on television by asking the Prime Minister some difficult questions. Her response was swift and sure. She called him...
Mr. Day.
Mr. Day. Could this be true? A slip of the tongue, surely. But no, she repeated it.
Yes, Mr. Day.
So there was no doubt about it. Sir Robin was now...
Mr. Day.
stripped of his knighthood. What a disgrace. Well, if you ask blunt questions, you get blunt treatment, so to speak. Now, you've probably been wondering why I haven't so far mentioned Dr. David Owen. Well, to be honest, some of his antics lately have barely been fit to transmit. But it has to be said that handsome, unattractive Dr. Owen has been prominent at SDP Liberal press conferences, where, as you can see, he sometimes appears to be taking the whole weight of the SDP Liberal alliance on his own head, in a balancing act of prodigious proportions. And he's been awfully mean about Labour's defence policy. He knows exactly where to put cruise missiles and Pershings, and as for dear old-fashioned Polarises, he's come up with a novel suggestion for re-sighting them.
For the period of a alliance government, were we to form it, our position is very clear. It is to put Polaris on the table.
Which, considering its age, seems the best place for it. Might always be useful as a paperweight. Around the constituencies, too, defence has been a keen issue. Now, you'll remember that Mr. Tevitt has condemned out of hand people who've been going to schools and indoctrinating the voters of tomorrow with all that stuff about nuclear weapons. One such was Conservative candidate Mr. Paul Marland, who took a Ministry of Defence propaganda film along to a school in his Gloucestershire constituency. After he'd expounded on the virtues of the Trident missile, one pupil asked, What about crews? Crews, said Mr. Marland. Crews? These missiles don't need crews. They're completely unmanned. Oh dear, you have to laugh. Which is why, like most programmes, scratching round for a new angle on the election, I've been seeking the wisdom of an objective foreign correspondent, Signor Sandro Paternostro of Italian television, to get the European perspective. What has interested him about the campaign?
Everything. Everything. The helicopters, the Prime Minister and leader of the majority party entertaining people about lobsters, Cyril Smith parading his double-barreled belly with the same nonchalance that a Frenchman would parade his mistress.
But are the British public being entertained by the election?
Well, the British public being involved can't be necessarily entertained. I mean, only when you make love, you are involved and not always, and you are entertained, or you entertain. That's the only case where entertainment and involvement go parallelly.
Which brings me to the subject of babies. Even Mr. Tebbit, a man once described by Michael Foote as a semi-house-trained polecat, has been polishing up his technique in this area.
I'm sorry about all these people. Can we give you a hand? How does it fold? I've lost the touch of this sort of thing, you know, over the last 15 years or so.
Let's hope he doesn't get made Minister for Technology. But no one can say that Norman lacks courage. Faced with the thought of hitherto undreamed-of rewards like popularity, not to say a vote, he risked all.
What do we do? Shall I hold the babe? Come on, I haven't lost the touch of that yet. No, I'm not actually going to kiss a baby, not without permission, anyway.
She might want to kiss you.
Not want to kiss Norman? What an idea. After all, Norman and this baby had something in common.
You look very severe, don't you? Oh, this is all good by-election stuff, isn't it? Now, after all that...
I'm not going to vote for you.
You're not going to vote for me? Not after I've held the baby?
No.
Oh dear. Nice try, Norman. Still, there's 8 days to go. Now, one of Mrs. Thatcher's great strengths has always been the man in her life.
Yeah.
But it won't have escaped your notice that there's now a new and younger man in her life. A man never far from her side, a man whose devotion knows no bounds. And at this morning's press conference, his big moment came. He stepped into her shoes for the first time. And very nice he looked in them. But will it be the last? Surely not. After all, the chairman of the Tory party has undoubtedly imprinted his ability and personality indelibly on the minds of the British public.
Who's Cecil Parkinson?
Labour, something Labour.
Who's Cecil Parkinson?
Something to do with the British Rail, is it?
And who's Cecil Parkinson?
Well, Cecil Parkinson is the... wait a minute, I think you've got me there. The character on ITV on Saturday morning, no?
He's the... Oh, dear.
Oh, dear, indeed. Finally, you may have seen rumours in today's papers about Michael Foote retiring. Well, whether or not they're true, it was obvious when we met him over the weekend that he had something to tell us. And indeed, later, he gave us an exclusive hint as to who the next Labour Party leader will be. Not Peter Shaw, not Dennis Healey, not even Pat Wall.
Looking forward to a great victory for Ben and for the Labour Party on June the 9th.
Ben? Good heavens. And he repeated it.
What I want to hear in a moment is a great big cheer for Ben and for a Labour victory on June the 9th. Hip, hip! Hip, hip!
I'll be back on June the 3rd with the diary that everyone is talking about, even Her Majesty.
We have seen it and it is wonderful.
Thank you, Ma'am.
And more from Glyn Worsnip's election diary. Those who are adamant that the race should be kept. And one of them is Jeff Duke, 6 times world champion and 5 times winner of the TT, who now in fact lives on the island. Martin Henfield of Look Northwest has been over to the island to talk to him.
I think it's a circuit which is difficult, and all racing is dangerous.
Well, now, with less than a week to go before polling day, it's time for another of our election diaries. Here again is Glyn Worsnip's very own look at how the campaign is going.
Well, as I expect you've noticed, the campaign has reached the stage where they're all beginning to get the teensiest, weensiest bit tense. Even the superbly poised ex-MP for Finchley has got a bit tetchy in the last day or two when required to answer queries on naval navigation of a southern hemispheric nature, though mostly, I'm happy to say, she's her usual modest self.
I know the facts. I know every single fact.
And I'm sure Mr. Foote is equally sure of his facts. It's just that Chairman Mortimer hasn't seemed equally sure that he's sure.
Michael, would you care to give the dates of these cuttings from the newspapers
Well,
where they have these?
I think
Financial Times, 28th of January, the Times.
Of course, they don't always interrupt their leader like that. Sometimes it's like this.
David, I think we need a quick meeting.
Or even like this.
If I could take just the unemployment problem.
As for the meeting of the Liberal SDP alliance, well, naturally, they too have the facts at their disposal. What a pity nobody yesterday seemed disposed to want to hear them.
Questions, please.
Oh. Meanwhile, out in the shires, the already confused electors were enchanted to hear Mr. Christopher Brocklebank Fowler, 15 years Conservative MP for Norfolk North West and the only Tory MP to defect to the SDP, greeting electors as follows. This is Christopher Fowler, your Conservative candidate, who has now joined the SDP. Meanwhile, down the mean streets of London, it was nice to meet a cabinet minister with nothing better to do, dealing in a practical way with unemployment in traditional Tory fashion. Obviously, the message is, if you want to get rich, take a tip from Heseltine. Now, I must apologise to those viewers who've complained about the general tone of my campaign diary. Yes, I have been a bit too serious. Where have all the loonies gone, asks Mrs. Aldous of Herefordshire, amongst others. Well, in view of the level of debate amongst the major parties, one hardly dare answer. However, in Bristol West, bed-sitting tenant Sebastian Boyle is holding surgeries and accepting election calls on the only phone available to him. Sadly, office space in his area is often oversubscribed, and as with Parliament, he's finding it hard to get in. And if you think this is turning the election into a pantomime, consider the electors of Windsor and Maidenhead, where the LIMP, or Local Independent Mushroom Party, has put up a pantomime horse. Amongst other things, this candidate pledges that all artificial sleeping policemen will be replaced with real ones. All he needs is a stable economy. Say what you like, there's only one Mrs. Thatcher. Except in East Cornwall, where there are two, Joy Dent and her agent, Liz Roberts, normally a cabaret act called Rubber Gloves.
When rubber gloves talk rubbish, you know it makes sense. Break the mold and coat rubber gloves.
And they're standing on a job-sharing ticket, preferably Mrs. Thatcher's. Now, this is the week, of course, when Dennis Healey went too far. And it's not just Mrs. Thatcher he's been attacking with his mouth.
Hello, love, how are you doing? Good, thank you. That was lovely.
Oh, well, you can't please everyone, though it's odd how many people find what Dennis does with his mouth attractive.
Oh, you're lovely.
Well done.
What I find distressing is the way he boasts about his sexual conquests.
We've just had a beauty. A real smacker.
Insatiable. Though I was glad to see there was no sign of Shirley MacLaine.
What a naughty girl.
Now, why doesn't he talk like that to Mrs. Thatcher instead of being so rude? Finally, I'm delighted to tell you that in response to public demand, the BBC has decided that my final campaign diary should be on Wednesday, the night before the election.
They've taken leave of their senses.
Isn't he sweet?
It's wicked stuff, isn't it? As he says, he'll be back next Wednesday. And that's really it from us. We'll be back on Monday, and we'll be marking the anniversary of D-Day. Hugh, you've been over to Normandy, haven't you?
Yes, I have, and we took with us two of the war widows whose husbands were killed in the fighting in Europe and who've never seen their husbands' graves. Indeed, they've never been abroad before. So it was quite a moving experience.
I'm sure. We look forward to seeing that on Monday. We'll also, on Monday, be talking to Twiggy about things professional and, indeed, personal. That's it. Have a good weekend from both of us now. Good night.
The alliance in the opinion polls, Mr. Foote and Mrs. Thatcher have been quick to point out that the poll that counts is on Thursday. As opinion polls and telephone polls on television.
Lynn Worsnip.
Well, the British people have had their say. The Granada 500, the Newsnight 100, the Nationwide 99, which I'd assumed was an ice cream until this evening. And in 12 hours or so, we will all finally go up the polls. But there's just time for one last opinion poll. It's a Maury poll conducted for the diary from a scientifically selected sample of one London taxi driver named Maury, who was parked outside the Alliance headquarters, though not in the middle of the road. The result is fascinating.
Whoever wins, the government still get in, don't they? No matter who you vote for.
The government's going to win it.
Indeed it is. Who can argue with that? Now, Mr. Francis Pym, the Foreign Secretary, was in fine form at this morning's press conference, though he seemed rather taken aback that anyone was still asking him about foreign policy.
I think, actually, that
thank you very much, sir. Is that your last word on the subject? Of course, it's the potential prime ministers who count, so remembering the enthusiasm of the Blessed Margaret for Victorian values and that in Victorian times electors consulted not swingometers, but phrenolometers, and discovering that there still is one phrenologist practicing in London, I consulted him on your behalf for a final eve of poll assessment. A phrenologist, of course, is someone who thinks that politicians should have their heads examined.
Well, let's begin with Mrs. Thatcher. What the old phrenologist would have done to start with would have been to get a measure of the distance between the ears and compare that to the distance across there to the crown of the head. Her head, however, has a problem, and that is that the distance between the ears, to the phrenologist at any rate, is relatively narrow. Furthermore, of course, her hair might be acting as a camouflage, concealing certain things. It looks as though there is a relative coldness in her, emotionally, from her head.
And if a cold in the head is her only problem, she should survive. Now, from head to foot.
Now, there is some comparison here between Mr. Foot's head and E.T.'s head. You've got a head with protuberances at the front indicating a good sense of humour, aesthetic, musical. He's probably a man who's good at dancing and singing from his head.
And any man capable of dancing from his head deserves our respect.
Now, have a look at this head. Now, what we've got here is a satisfying, warm, round head. A head which is not complicated by too much expression of thought and intelligence. It's a head which is primitive rather than intellectual. But what is most noticeable about him are these round areas around the ears. These are where you find the bumps of enjoyment of eating, of life, vitativeness, as the Victorians like to call it, a love of life. All these rich areas round here.
And for Mr. Jenkins, of course, it's not so much the rich areas round his head that count, it's the rich areas around Hill Head. Of course, as everyone knows, the role of the press, the capitalist hyenas of Fleet Street, has always been to trample Labour into the mire and praise the Tories to the skies. Typical is the way this headline, which is actually about the crisis in the Scottish shipyards, is cunningly set alongside a picture of the unfortunate Mr. Foote. Disgraceful. And that was in Labour News. Now, I'm sure you remember this decent, honest, legal and truthful advertisement placed by the Tories some weeks past, offering 10 bottles of claret for the best answers to this question. Well, yesterday, the young SDP themselves turned up not only with 100 such policies, but some cans of what they termed conservative bitter, which they hoped to exchange for the claret. Sadly, it seemed, from what a Tory spokesman said, that the rules of engagement had changed, so although they were still several yards outside the Central Office exclusion zone, they were seen off by a task force policing the area with its usual courtesy and charm.
Can you get your beer on board and away?
Well, we'll still have some of our people there, that's all.
Come on in.
Yes, we should have to pick them up with your beer. Right now, that's all right,
Sorry? Assaulting me?
No, I'm just trying to shut the door so we can drive away.
Don't start shutting the door on me, unless you find yourself in police station.
So there. And no claret for Mr. Jenkins' boys, who now more than ever share their leader's opinion of the Tories. Throughout the campaign, of course, this diary, like other programmes, has been keeping a special eye on the key marginal constituencies. But we've concentrated not on Bolton or Lewisham, but on an area which somehow has escaped the attention of other programmes, even though in some ways it's considerably more marginal than any other. Come with me now to Little Eccleston in Lancashire. And here we are in Little Eccleston. It's a beautiful little village like any other with only 250 souls. But what separates Little Eccleston from other villages at election time is the fact that it's got a Labour candidate and a Conservative candidate and an Alliance candidate and another Alliance candidate, morning, and another Conservative candidate and another Labour candidate and another Labour candidate and another Alliance candidate and another Conservative candidate. And as you see, they've got an independent candidate as well.
In fact, it's got 2 independents, bringing the total number of candidates to 11, or 1 candidate for every 22 voters. Because whereas most constituencies contain several villages, this village contains several constituencies, which is as inconvenient for the villagers as it's confusing for the candidates.
I think you're in the Lancaster constituency with Bill Booth.
No,
Or are you in Fylde?
Fylde?
Fylde. That's where you have to pay your rates, sir.
Yes. Ah. No, it isn't. It's that way. You want to be going that way, and I'm going this way.
Well, this
Yes.
is Fowle constituency.
Yes, well,
so
you
this
go-
must be within the constituency.
You go that way, and I'll go this way, because my chap's up here, I know.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
then.
See you later, Bill. Yep.
Meanwhile, at the other end of the village, the Labour candidates have discovered that the houses on one side of the toll bridge are in filed, and the toll house on the other is in wire. Not that that worries the Tories. They've been here before.
And that's Great Eccleston over there, which
Yes,
you've
sir.
presented to Lancaster.
Oh, yes.
And all that is in filed.
That's right.
And we've got the one house over here, which is in wire, the toll house.
What are you doing coming from that direction?
I don't know, because that Leckenby Lodge is yours.
That's
I'm,
true.
I'm Leckenby Hall, so
Yes.
I want to be over here.
Yes, but you've just come down through my constituency.
I know, but this is Leckenby Hall. I've got to go
Because
here, so I've got to
whereas
go
Leckenby Hall is found filed under Lancaster,
You go,
Leckenby Lodge, which was built by the owners of Leckenby Hall, was filed under filed. This is because, although they're both on the Little Eccleston side of the main road, one is in the parish of Great Eccleston and one in Little Eccleston with Larbreck, or, as the boundary post puts it, filed RDC or Garstang RDC, neither of which any longer apply. In any case, the residents of Leckenby Lodge aren't registered in either constituency.
Yes, but of course now you can go into Blackpool and you can vote.
Still, there can surely be no one, absolutely no one in Little Eccleston who can claim that they haven't had a chance to meet a candidate.
And after all the canvassing by all the candidates among all the people of Little Eccleston, there's only one problem. The village doesn't have a polling station.
Very ridiculous, isn't it?
Don't worry, Ma'am, they will all get a vote. The kindly returning officer is sending a special mobile polling station.
I am greatly relieved.
So am I. And just before closing this campaign diary, may I say just one final thing. Vote Labour, or vote Conservative, or vote Alliance, or anything, but do vote. They've all worked so hard, the poor dears, and it's the least we can do to repay them for all the laughs they've given us.
Glyn Worsnip with his last election diary. I'm sure the politicians won't mourn his passing, but we certainly shall. Good evening. Nationwide tonight, going, gone. We report on the Americans who have £1 million a week to spend on our art treasures.
And the men and women who've been putting their jobs on the line today. What's it like to be out on your ear after a lifetime in Parliament?
That he will be happy with the constituency, I have no doubt. I only hope the constituency can be happy with him.
And completing our guide to election night, we'll be visiting the studio that for the next 24 hours will house the biggest broadcasting event of the year. We also have the complete survival guide to staying up for the results. And for those determined to get away from politics, we've found just the place. It's warm, it's cosy, and it's only £3,000.
But first, going, gone, at least. An auction of a very different nature has been going on all over Britain today. We've been going to the polls to elect the next Parliament. The first results start coming through in fewer than 5 hours' time, I think, by which time the BBC's election programme will be in full swing. So Hugh's been touring our election studio. He's been meeting the men and the machinery that make it work.
This studio, Studio 6 at Television Centre, normally plays host to Top of the Pops. And Juliet Bravo also comes from here. Not that you'd know that today, because the studio has been completely stripped out and redesigned to accommodate the election programme. And they've also taken over the next-door studio to house the backup production facilities to support Sir Robin Day, Peter Snow and David Dimbleby, who'll be taking us through the night from that main desk behind me. Any election programme stands or falls on the speed of getting the results onto the air. To do that, there are 650 reporters, one in each constituency, with a line straight through to the election studio, to this desk, where the results are fed to David Dimbleby, Peter Snow, and into the computer. It's designed to be the quickest result service on the air. In addition to that, there are 50 outside broadcasts in key constituencies all over the country. And the man who coordinates all that is engineering manager Paul Mason. It's a very complex operation.
It certainly is.
Does it worry you?
No, I'm actually pleased now to get into the studio and to get things underway. We've had about 4 very hard-working, very tiring weeks. It's quite satisfying to be almost there.
It's all very calm and collected now, but come 10 o'clock this evening?
Come 10 o'clock this evening, it won't be the engineers making the noise.
Peter Snow's role is to analyse the results as they come in and predict, with the help of his computer, the effect of trends on the final solution. For the past few days, he and the rest of the election team have been busy learning how to make the best use of the technical equipment available to them.
Blue at the moment. If the Tories capture it, it'll go red. As you were.
One of the most interesting technical aids available to the team tonight will be this computer, which is linked through to one of the Oxford colleges. That college has the results of a survey of opinion carried out among the prospective members of Parliament. How do they feel about the major issues of the day, things like unemployment, the economy, membership of the common market, defence, capital punishment, and so on. And so as we go through the evening, the presenters of the programme will be able to tell you how opinion is shifting in the new Parliament. Are there more or less MPs in favour of capital punishment? How do the new members feel about buying another generation of submarine-based nuclear missile? And all through this computer. But for all the technical aids, one of the simplest ever invented will be missing this year. The late and lamented Bob Mackenzie died in 1981. Bob and his famous swingometer had been a familiar part of BBC election coverage since the 1950s.
Put them together, average them. The final polls are saying this: a swing of 4.7% to the Conservatives.
Hugh, this time, instead of the old swingometer, we've got a new electronic display that will describe the way the party battles are going. Here, for example, is the Conservative-Labour battleground, starting with the most vulnerable Labour seat in the country and running all the way down through 60 vulnerable seats, each one of them numbered, and they're all red at the moment. Now, if the Tories capture any of those,
after the programme. It's a disaster. I mean, I can't, as a matter of fact, I can't even have half a glass of white wine before broadcasting anyway, because, again, you're so active that it has a terrible effect. I don't take any of those sort of how to keep awake as a bomber pilot pills or anything like that either. I don't do anything special, really. I drink a little black coffee. I suck glucose pills because it gives you a kind of constant energy, and eat biscuits, that's all. I'm nothing special.
Do you limit your intake of liquids?
Well, this is the earth question.